Hello, it's John Heaton, and this evening I'm going to do a review of the concert for Bangladesh. And this is my vinyl copy, which is not in great shape. As you can see, I was pretty immature. Stuck a picture of George on the cover back when I was 15 or so, and then picture of George and Ringo on the inside here. But so the box has come apart, but the records are in quite good shape, and this is the booklet with the guitar case with all the aid going to Bangladesh, and nice concept and nice pictures inside of Bob and George, Ringo, and Leon and Billy, all the performers. So this concert, it has to be said, was at a time when it was only about 18 months after the Beatles split up, so the solo Beatles were still important artists, and to get two ex-Beatles on the stage together was quite an achievement and quite an event. And then when George managed to get all the guest stars that he managed to assemble, it was just pretty monumental, and it's often been said it's the first of its kind. Live Aid and Live 8 and all those Farm Aids stuff came years later. This was the first one, and I think it's commendable. George deserves a lot of credit for this. I'm not necessarily buying that George was the most charitable of the Beatles, because I think the other Beatles were charitable in their own way. They just chose different ways in which to give, and George, as we know, was flawed as much as any other human being. He was not perfect, so I don't like this deification of George as the only spiritual Beatle, because I don't think that's fair. But having said that, hats off to him for taking what was a considerable risk, because it could have been a flop if no one had agreed to turn up. But luckily they did. And by the way, the records are on this Bangladesh label, and they're in pretty good shape, but actually my records are screwed up. Side 1 and side 6 are on this disc, and sides 5 and 2 are on this disc. Side 3 and 4 are okay, so a bit of a cock up in the pressing plant for that. And one hears amusing stories about the people who videoed the concert. Neil Aspinall is on record saying, everyone started filming at the same time, so everyone ran out of tape at the same time. And other stories that they were out of their head on whatever, so they didn't capture the concert as well as they could have done. But I have to say, watching this, I don't listen to the album that often, but I do go back to the video quite often because I've got 2 copies of this DVD box set, one in mint condition, which is this one, and one which I think I sent some postcards to some friends. So this is beautiful postcards of George, and there's Ravi Shankar and another one of George, and there's Billy here, and there's Ringo. Just great postcards, and then handwritten lyrics for Bangladesh. Nice to have, kind of in Army Mine type style. A nice Apple sticker, not to be confused with the computer Apple. This is the great Beatles Apple. And then a concert poster, which I won't open up, but well, I will open it maybe. This is announcing the concert. And then the DVD itself, which is got the concert on disc 1, and then disc 2 has a whole load of extras, which are brilliant, and I'll come to that in a minute, including a documentary with interviews from most of the players who were involved, with the exception of George, because he passed away when this came out in, I think it was 2005. Well, you got interviews with Liam Russell, Eric Clapton. Liam Russell's since just recently passed away, and then Billy Preston, who's also passed away. So a lot of these people are no longer with us, but this DVD is a great opportunity to see their views. Eric Clapton is interviewed, Bob Dylan is not, unsurprisingly. So I want to talk about the set list, because when George first put together the set list, he considered including All Things Must Pass, the track, which I think would have been a great addition to this album. George actually only sings 8 tracks on this triple album, which is not enough in my opinion. So All Things Must Pass was considered, as was the B-side of the Bangladesh single, Deep Blue, which had come out maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the concert, and wasn't a huge hit. I think it hit the top 10, but it performed the job for which it was intended, and the concert also did that to a greater degree in terms of bringing greater visibility to the problems happening in Bangladesh. So, and the lyrics say it all to that song. My friend came to me with sadness in his eyes, told me that he needed help before his country dies. So George wrote the song Bangladesh. It's not his greatest ever song, and he struggles to sing it because it's in quite a high key, but it's very bouncy and full of energy, and Liam Russell, I think, is on piano. And the original set list also was going to have Watching the River Flow, which was Bob Dylan's current single with Liam Russell on piano. So that would have been cool, but Bob chose to do some older numbers in the end. And incidentally, there was no Badfinger solo tracks even contemplated, and it would have been a very brave and great move if Badfinger, Pete Ham, had performed day after day with the band, because George Harrison had just produced that a month or 2 before this concert. But anyway, Badfinger, as it happened, didn't get a solo spot, and they were performing admirably on acoustic guitars, trying to mimic the production on All Things Must Pass. But I have to say, the All Things Must Pass material on this concert is decent, but it's not as good as the album, let's face it. The acoustic guitars are not as prevalent, and the backing vocalists, I think George called it the George O'Hara Smith Singers or something, where George himself overlaid his backing vocals time after time after time on particularly My Sweet Lord. And here on this concert, you have a couple of female vocalists and maybe 4 people singing background vocals. It's okay, but My Sweet Lord, the track in particular, is not as majestic on this concert as on the album. They do creditable versions of Beware of Darkness and Waiting on You All, but they could have done, I guess they could have done a lot of songs from All Things Must Pass, really. I mean, they could have done Apple Scruffs or Isn't It a Pity? Maybe All Things Must Pass was deemed to be not that lyrically appropriate for a problem such as Bangladesh, because the last thing they were thinking of saying was All Things Must Pass. They were saying, well, look at this problem, let's do something about it, not All Things Must Pass. So maybe that was the reason that got left out. And also considered on the set list, which didn't get included in the end, was George and Bob doing a version of If Not For You, a duet. And it wasn't included in the final concert, but I'm happy to say on disc 2 of the DVD you get superb bonus features, including some of these tracks which didn't make the final cut, so from the rehearsals, including If Not For You from George and Bob, including Love Minus Zero No Limit from Bob Dylan, which I think he performed in the first show. There were two shows, the afternoon and the evening show. And there's a song about something to do with the kitchen from Leon Russell, which is also very enjoyable. So those are good outtakes. And what else can be said? Wah Wah opens the concert. I mean, Ravi Shankar opens the concert and does some pretty nifty sitar playing, and they tried to, I think, do some faster numbers to make it more interesting for the audience. And then they went off after 15 minutes, and Wah Wah, George came on with his band and opened with Wah Wah, which is performed pretty admirably, I have to say. Not quite as good as the album version, but we all know that song was written about the Beatles' breakup. And a couple of people have said it's a shame that the Beatles didn't reunite for Bangladesh, but I don't buy that. I think Paul and John were well within their rights not to perform with George at this concert. I think it's Peter Doggett in his book who takes issue with John and Paul for being selfish, for not, recognising the wider, the charitable cause and turning up. But I don't see it that way. The Beatles had just broken up, as Paul said, and Paul thought, well, what's the point in getting back together? Whoever it's for. And it would have been a little bit false, I think, if they had. Can you imagine Paul in 71 turning up and playing at a George concert? And this was right at the time that John was recording How Do You Sleep, so it would have been very strange for Paul and John to appear with George and Ringo. It was good enough, to be honest, having two ex-Beatles performing. And I'm happy with the way it turned out, to be honest with you. And what else could be said? Billy Preston does a great version of That's the Way God Planned It. And he gets a bit carried away and dances around the stage, and that's done to great effect. Leon Russell is given 2 solo numbers, which I think is probably a little bit excessive. As I say, I would have preferred Badfinger to sing a song. Leon does a good, reasonable version of Jumping Jack Flash and a creditable version of Young Blood. But I think he should have just been given 1 number. And Eric Clapton was down to do Let It Rain, but he was a little bit out of it at the time. He was in his heroin phase, and they were lucky enough to get him on a plane to turn up to this gig, let alone play, let alone sing a solo number. And apparently he's interviewed on this disc, by the way, on the second disc, and he said that he was so out of it he even brought the wrong guitar, which was not very suitable to play the solos on while on the guitar and whatever else he played on. Well, the whole concert really. So George panicked when it looked as if Eric was not turning up, and invited Jesse Ed Davis to be the replacement, and they ended up both playing. And on drums you've got Jim Keltner, the faithful Jim Keltner, who's played with all kinds of people, including most of John and George's solo work and Ringo's as well. And who else have we got? Who else have I forgotten? Klaus Voormann on bass, of course. The faithful Klaus Voormann, who they knew from the Hamburg days, and he does a great job. He's not actually interviewed on this CD, on this DVD for some reason, but anyway, I would recommend. I don't listen to the album very often, but I do come back to the concert. I was just watching it the other night, with my son Tommy, and it's just brilliant. And as I say, at the time that this concert came out, the solo Beatles were pretty much the biggest stars on earth. So to have 2 solo Beatles plus Bob Dylan was a big deal. And of course we know all the charitable concerts came later, like Live Aid and Live 8 and Farm Aid. But I think Bangladesh was in many ways the best because it was the first, and because it featured two Beatles, because it featured Bob Dylan. And by the way, Bob Dylan's section, which takes up the entire side 5 of the album, is just brilliant. I mean, he's not playing his recent New Morning stuff. He's going back, not that far, but he's going back to Just Like a Woman from '66, Blonde on Blonde. And then he's playing Mr. Tambourine Man in the second set from '65, and Blowing in the Wind, and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and Takes a Lot to Laugh, A Train to Cry. And the great selections. I mean, I guess he just did them to please the crowd, and they sure did please the crowd. I mean, he could have played Watching the River Flow, no one would have complained, I don't think. But I think he sensed the enormity of the occasion and just came up with 5 of his best ever songs. And quite an interesting story about, Klaus was saying, well, I'll play bass on the tracks with Bob, and Lee and Russell said, no, I'll play bass. So a bit of rivalry there, and you'll see when Bob performs, it's just a 4-man band. It's Leon on bass, George on guitar, Bob on guitar and harmonica, and Ringo on some kind of tambourine. So memorable, and then the whole show finishes with George doing a good version of something, obviously not as good as Abbey Road, How Can It Be, and then a very rousing version of Bangladesh to end the concert. So on the whole, I mean, as I say, I don't listen to the album, but I watch the video quite often. Would have liked to see more George tracks, but that's a minor criticism. It's a great concert, it's a great video, and I'm not going to even give it a mark out of 10. It's just timeless. And thanks for watching. See you next time.